New York, the Gilded Age. On the bank of the Hudson, a monster of stone and marble rises. The biggest private palace in the city. This is Schwab Mansion, the dark story of New York's largest Gilded Age mansion. Its owner is a steel king who grew up poor and decided to take revenge on the world with luxury. The palace is bigger than museums. Inside there is a private theater, a winter garden, a ballroom. But there is one problem. It stands in the wrong place. The old money on Fifth Avenue despise it, and newspapers mock the house as nouveau riche taste. Behind these windows, it is not only a party. This is a story about the loneliness of a millionaire who is scared of falling from the top, about parties meant to buy respect, and bills that slowly eat away his fortune. Then, the unthinkable happens. In just a few decades, the biggest palace in New York becomes something nobody wants. People try to sell it, rent it, turn it into something simpler. And in the end, the city wipes it off the map as if it never existed. How did a house built to prove that you had won at life turn into a warning for anyone who dreams of endless wealth? And what is left of Schwab Mansion today? If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture and the families who built it, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which house to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Chapter 1. The Day New York Killed a Palace. January 1948. A cold morning on Riverside Drive. On the opposite side of the street, an old man stands at his apartment window. Below him, a wrecking ball hangs motionless in front of the largest private residence New York has ever known. The Schwab Mansion, 75 rooms of French chateau grandeur, towers reaching toward a gray winter sky, waits for its execution. The first blow lands. Stone dust explodes where stained glass windows once filtered soft afternoon light. The sound rolls across the Hudson River, a deep, hollow crack that seems to split not only masonry, but an entire era of American ambition. On the sidewalk below, a small crowd has gathered. They pull their coats tighter, their breath hanging in the air, and whisper about the man who built this place, who died nearly penniless just a few years earlier, and about how the city never truly loved his dream. But this story does not begin with destruction. It begins with hunger. With a boy from Pennsylvania coal country who understood that America's industrial revolution would reward those bold enough to bet everything on steel. Charles M. Schwab was not born into wealth. He came into a world of smoke and noise, and the pounding rhythm of blast furnaces. Somewhere in those early years, watching men disappear into blackened mills at dawn, he decided that he would never be small again. The mansion he would one day build was not simply a house. It was a declaration. A stone manifesto meant to prove that a Catholic boy from nowhere could stand among the Protestant aristocracy of Fifth Avenue, could in fact surpass them. When Schwab purchased an entire city block between 73rd and 74th Streets on Riverside Drive, the old money families watched with barely concealed disdain. Everyone knew that the right address was Fifth Avenue. Riverside Drive was the wrong side of Central Park, the view side rather than the status side. Schwab did not care. He hired architect Maurice Heber and gave him a single instruction: build something that would make Andrew Carnegie's mansion look modest. Between 1902 and 1906, workers transformed the site. They imported pink granite and carved it into towers inspired by the chateau of France's Loire Valley. The cost crept towards $7 million. For context, the average American worker earned less than $500 per year. The finished mansion was almost absurd in its scale: 75 rooms, a bowling alley, a gymnasium, a swimming pool, 3 elevators, its own private power plant, a winter garden where tropical plants flourished while snow piled up on Riverside Drive outside. At the heart of it all, stood a great hall with a pipe organ whose music could roll through every corridor and gallery. When Andrew Carnegie first visited, he reportedly looked up at the soaring ceilings and muttered, half amused, half stunned, "Now my house looks like a shack." It was meant as a compliment, but it carried the weight of prophecy, because the Schwab mansion contained a flaw no marble could hide. It stood in the wrong place. Fifth Avenue society never fully accepted Charles Schwab. The whispers never stopped. Nouveau riche. Steal money. Newspapers loved to set photographs of his palace beside stories about his gambling in Monte Carlo, about the fast life that followed him from continent to continent. His wife, Emma, walked those enormous halls and understood something her husband refused to accept. The house was simply too big for two people with no children. The staff numbered in the dozens, and still the rooms felt hollow, like a grand hotel that had somehow forgotten to invite its guests. For nearly 2 decades, Schwab tried to fill that emptiness with people and music. Musicians performed in the Great Hall. He opened his doors to presidents and princes. On winter evenings, the mansion blazed with light, glowing above Riverside Drive like a landlocked ocean liner moored in stone. But behind the spectacle, something was rotting. When the stock market crashed in 1929, the steel industry staggered with it. Suddenly, the man who could afford to heat 75 rooms struggled to pay his property taxes. Schwab tried everything. He offered the mansion to the city as an official mayoral residence. Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia came in person, walked slowly through the marble halls, and in the end, delivered the verdict that sealed the building's fate. What? Me and that? In the depths of the Depression, with millions struggling just to pay rent, a politician living in that kind of splendor was unthinkable. The city declined. No benefactor stepped forward. The palace stayed, but its future quietly vanished. Emma died in 1939. Charles, broken in health and fortune, moved to a modest apartment. He never slept in his palace again. When he died later that same year, his debts exceeded his assets. The man who had once commanded billions left this world owing money. The mansion limped on without him. It was carved up into apartments. Victory gardens sprouted on lawns where carriages had once rolled in neat circles. And then, in 1948, the wrecking ball arrived on Riverside Drive. Today, if you walk along that stretch between 73rd and 74th Streets, you see nothing remarkable. Just an ordinary apartment building called Schwab House. Dogs tug at leashes. Joggers pass by with headphones in. Almost no one looks up. Almost no one imagines the towers that once pierced this same sky. The Schwab Mansion was the largest private home ever built in New York City. It survived for less than half a century, and its disappearance leaves a question hanging in the air. What does it mean to build something so big that the world cannot, or will not, contain it? In the next chapter, we walk these same streets, hold up photographs of what once stood here, and trace how a boy from coal country became the man who built and lost a palace. Chapter 2. A Ghost Block in Modern Manhattan. The photographs feel impossible. You stand on the corner of 73rd Street and Riverside Drive, holding a faded image from 1910. In the picture, a French chateau swallows the entire block. Towers, turrets, steep slate roofs, windows catching the pale morning sun. You look up from the photograph. In front of you stands a plain red brick apartment building, 15 stories of ordinary windows, a doorman in a gray uniform, a woman walking a golden retriever, the same corner, the same coordinates, a completely different world. This is what remains of Charles Schwab's dream. A name on an awning. Schwab House. Most residents have no idea why their building carries that title. They know nothing of the palace that stood here. The the parties that flooded these blocks with music. The Steel King who believed he could buy a kind of immortality in stone. The city erased him so thoroughly that even his ghost would struggle to find its way home. And yet ghosts leave traces. If you know where to look, you can still see them. Walk south along Riverside Drive and watch how the lots change size. Most blocks hold several buildings, narrow pre-war apartments pressed together like books on a crowded shelf. But between 73rd and 74th, there is only one structure. The footprint is wrong. Too wide. Too generous for Manhattan real estate math. This is the scar tissue of Schwab's ambition. When developers cleared the ruins in 1948, they inherited a plot so massive that only a single enormous building could fill it. The proportions remember what the architecture forgot. Step into Riverside Park, just across the street, and find a bench facing west. This is roughly where Schwab himself would have stood on summer evenings, watching the sun slide behind the Palisades of New Jersey. The view has hardly changed. The Hudson still catches gold and copper light. Sailboats still drift toward the harbor. He chose this site precisely for that vista. Proof that new money could claim the same horizons as old money, could watch the same sunsets, could feel the same river breeze on its face. The irony cuts deep. Schwab chose Riverside Drive because Fifth Avenue society rejected him. If they would not let him into their neighborhood, he would build something grander in his own. But the very act of building elsewhere froze his outsider status in stone. The mansion was not just a triumph, it was a confession. Now pull out your phone. Search for historical photographs of the Schwab mansion and hold them up against the modern skyline. The overlay is haunting. Where joggers now pass, carriages once lined a curving driveway. Where the doorman stands, footmen in livery greeted senators and industrialists. The Winter Garden, that glass paradise of tropical plants, occupied roughly the spot where a first-floor fitness center now hums with treadmills and elliptical machines. Scale is the hardest thing to grasp. We are used to large buildings in Manhattan, but Schwab's mansion was not a skyscraper. It spread outward, like a European estate dropped onto an American grid. Contemporary accounts describe visitors approaching from Broadway and stopping mid-stride, unable to process what they were seeing. A chateau in Manhattan, sprawling over more ground than many city parks. The neighbors must have felt something between awe and resentment. Imagine living in a modest brownstone and watching, month after month, as workers hauled pink granite up Riverside Drive, watching towers rise, where rows of tenements might have stood, watching one man's ego quietly redraw the outline of your skyline, and yet the mansion also brought something the neighborhood had never known: prestige. Property values along Riverside Drive climbed throughout the 1910s. Other wealthy families, encouraged by Schwab's example, began building their own grand homes nearby. For a brief golden moment, the wrong side of Central Park seemed ready to rival Fifth Avenue itself. That moment did not last. The Depression crushed Riverside Drive's ambitions along with Schwab's fortune. Grand houses became boarding homes. Elegant apartments were chopped into smaller units. The wealthy retreated to their traditional strongholds on the East Side, and the West Side settled into a different identity: more bohemian, more middle class, more forgiving of eccentricity and experiment. Today, Riverside Drive is beautiful but not fashionable, quiet but not prestigious. The street has made a kind of peace with its history. Yet somewhere beneath the pavement, beneath the foundations of Schwab House, fragments of the original mansion may still lie hidden. Archaeologists have never opened the ground here. No one knows what the wrecking crews buried when they cleared the rubble. What carved stones, what shattered tiles, what remnants of a world that disappeared within a single generation. The ghost block keeps its secrets. But we do not need archaeology to understand what happened on this corner. We need only follow the money, follow the ambition, follow a young man from the coal fields of Pennsylvania as he climbs toward a fortune that will build an empire and then slowly devour it. Charles Schwab's story begins not in Manhattan, but in a small town called Williamsburg, and in the shadow of Andrew Carnegie, the Scotsman, who would teach him everything about steel and nothing about restraint. Chapter 3. Steel Kid from Nowhere, Williamsburg, Pennsylvania. Not the trendy Brooklyn neighborhood, but a small town in the Allegheny Mountains, where the air tasted of coal dust and the rivers ran brown with industrial runoff. This is where Charles Michael Schwab entered the world on February 18, 1862, the first of 4 children born to John and Pauline Schwab. The family was Catholic in Protestant country, German-speaking in an English world, poor in an era when poverty meant survival, not inconvenience. John Schwab worked first as a weaver, then as a livery stable keeper, respectable trades that provided shelter and food, but nothing resembling security. Young Charles grew up knowing that the line between getting by and going under was thinner than thread. But he also grew up watching something astonishing take shape just miles from his home. The steel industry was transforming Western Pennsylvania into the engine room of a new American economy. Blast furnaces lit the night sky orange. Railroad tracks spread across the landscape like metal veins. Men who had been farmers a generation earlier now fed ore into machines that produced the bones of bridges, the skeletons of buildings, the rails that stitched together a continent. The noise was constant. The heat was brutal. The chances for a different life were real, if you knew how to grab them. Schwab intended to grab them. At 17, he talked his way into a job at Andrew Carnegie's Edgar Thomson Steel Works in Braddock, Pennsylvania. His first position was humble, a stake driver in the engineering department, earning $1 per day. But Schwab possessed 2 qualities more valuable than any technical skill. He could do mathematics in his head faster than most men could do it on paper, and he could talk to anyone, foremen, laborers, executives, with a warmth that made each of them feel like the most important person in the room. Carnegie noticed the Scottish immigrant who would become America's richest man had a particular genius for spotting talent. He saw in Schwab something that looked uncomfortably familiar from his own youth: hunger that could not be satisfied, ambition that treated every obstacle as an invitation. Within 6 months, Schwab was moved fully into the engineering department. Within 2 years, he was a superintendent. By the time he was 25, he was running the entire Homestead Steel Works, one of the largest and most profitable plants on Earth. The speed of his rise bordered on the absurd. Men twice his age, with decades more experience, found themselves reporting to this smooth-talking kid from Williamsburg. Some resented him. Most could not help admiring his drive. Schwab arrived at the plant before dawn and left after dark. He memorized the names of workers' wives and children. He remembered birthdays. When the company's official rewards felt stingy, he pulled money from his own pocket to hand out bonuses. This was not simple manipulation. Or rather, it was a kind of manipulation so open and sincere that it stopped feeling like manipulation at all. Schwab genuinely liked people. He found their stories interesting, their problems worth his time. In an industry defined by brutal labor relations, where strikes were broken with bullets and union organizers simply vanished, Schwab represented something rare: a boss whom workers did not hate. Carnegie loved him for it. The older man had spent years building an empire through efficiency and ruthlessness. But he understood that steel was ultimately made by human beings, and human beings worked harder for leaders they trusted. In Schwab, Carnegie found someone who could wring maximum productivity from a workforce without inspiring maximum resentment. By 1897, Schwab was president of Carnegie Steel. He was 35 years old. The position made him rich beyond anything his father could have imagined. But wealth, for Schwab, was never the true endpoint. Money was proof that he had escaped the poverty of his childhood, that he had become someone whose name mattered. The problem with proof is that it never feels like enough. Every milestone demanded a larger milestone. Every success whispered that failure was still possible. Carnegie understood that hunger because he carried the same demon, but Carnegie also knew when to stop. In 1901, he sold his steel empire to J.P. Morgan for $480 million, the largest business transaction in history at that time. He spent the rest of his life trying to give that money away, building libraries, funding universities, racing to die as close to poor as a millionaire could manage. Schwab drew a different lesson from their partnership. He saw what money could build. He watched Carnegie's mansions rise in Manhattan and in Scotland. He attended parties where the guest lists read like a census of American power. And he decided that he would build something even grander, not to donate, but to keep. A monument to himself. A palace that would announce, in stone and slate and glass, that Charles Schwab from Williamsburg, Pennsylvania, had arrived. The land on Riverside Drive was waiting. The architects were ready. The only real question was whether a fortune forged in steel could support a dream poured entirely out of pride. In the next chapter, we watch that dream take shape and meet the army of workers who turned one man's ambition into 75 rooms of stone. Chapter 4. A French Chateau on the Wrong Side. The year was 1901. Charles Schwab stood on an empty lot stretching from 73rd to 74th Street along Riverside Drive, watching the Hudson River shimmer in the autumn light. Behind him lay Central Park, and beyond its trees, the limestone palaces of Fifth Avenue where Vanderbilts and Astors held court. They had not truly invited him into that world. Not in the way that mattered. He was still steel money, still new, still not quite acceptable. So he decided to build his own world, right here, on the supposed wrong side of the park. The land already carried a story, just not one Schwab cared to highlight. It had once housed an orphan asylum, a grim institutional block where homeless children slept in rows of narrow beds beneath bare ceilings. When the asylum relocated, the structure came down. The ground sat vacant, more burden than prize. Schwab, flush with his share of the Carnegie Steel sale, saw opportunity where others saw inconvenience and bad memories. He paid approximately $865,000 for the entire block. Then, he went shopping for an architect. His choice startled New York's establishment. Instead of hiring a celebrated firm like McKim, Mead, and White, Schwab selected Maurice Haber, a talented but relatively unknown designer who had trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. The decision was deliberate. Schwab wanted someone who would execute his vision, not fight him with their own. He wanted control over every line. The instructions were simple and ruthless. Study the great chateaux of France's Loire Valley, Chenonceau, Chambord, Azay-le-Rideau, and fuse their finest elements into something new, something unprecedented, something that would make every mansion on Fifth Avenue look, by comparison, like a respectable townhouse. Hebert delivered. Construction began in 1902 and continued for 4 full years. At its peak, the project employed over 600 workers, stonemasons from Italy, carpenters from Germany, iron workers drawn from across the eastern seaboard. They arrived before dawn, climbed scaffolding that seemed to scrape the clouds, and spent their days turning raw stone, timber, and iron into a fantasy one man could call home. The numbers alone bent belief. 75 rooms, 40 bathrooms, a basement level that held a bowling alley, a gymnasium, and a swimming pool lined with hand-painted Italian tiles. 3 elevators, mechanical marvels in an age when most New Yorkers still trusted their legs more than cables. A private electrical plant, so the lights would never depend on the city's unreliable grid. And in the Great Hall, a pipe organ, whose music could spill out onto Riverside Drive when the tall windows stood open. Everywhere, details whispered of European aristocracy, carved limestone facades, steep slate roofs imported from France, towers that rose roughly 75 feet above street level, a sweeping porte cochere where carriages could deposit guests directly beneath a marble entrance hall, far from wind or rain, wrought iron gates bearing the Schwab family crest. A crest Charles commissioned specifically for the house, since his family had never possessed an ancestral coat of arms. This was the paradox at the heart of the project. Schwab wanted a mansion that looked centuries old, a chateau that implied generations of inherited wealth and polish. Yet every stone shouted the opposite. This was new money, straining to look ancient. The house was a costume, and everyone in New York society understood the role it was trying to play. The workers, of course, did not lose sleep over social symbolism. They cared about wages, safety, and the daily grind of raising a palace from Manhattan bedrock. Contemporary accounts say almost nothing about their lives. History rarely remembers the names of those who build monuments for others. But we can picture their days, the weight of granite blocks biting into gloved hands, dust that clung to lungs and clothing, the sharp wind on scaffolding high above Riverside Drive. The constant risk that a single misstep could turn a day's work into disaster. Some of them likely lived in Lower East Side tenements, in rooms smaller than Schwab's planned closets. Each morning they crossed the city to the Upper West Side, built a level of luxury they would never inhabit, then returned at night to apartments without running water or proper heat. This was the arithmetic of the Gilded Age. Some men dreamed in marble, and other men made those dreams solid, for about $1 a day. By 1906, the mansion stood complete. Final cost estimates ranged from $6 to $7 million, figures the newspapers printed again and again, with a mix of awe and disapproval. For that sum, the city could have built dozens of schools or hundreds of affordable housing units. Instead, the money produced a single private residence for one man, his wife, and their household staff. The opening was not so much a party as a procession. New York's elite came one after another to see what Schwab had conjured out of stone and steel, and to decide whether he had finally bought his way into their ranks. They crossed the threshold into the marble entrance hall. They climbed the grand staircase beneath chandeliers. They paused in the winter garden, where tropical plants bloomed year-round in carefully managed warmth while snow fell quietly outside. And they whispered. In the next chapter, we step inside those rooms at their peak and discover that even the grandest house cannot fill the emptiness at its center. Chapter 5. Opening Night, a Palace and a Question. The whispers lasted for weeks. New York society had seen mansions before, the Vanderbilt palaces on Fifth Avenue, the Astor strongholds, the Morgan Library. But nothing had prepared them for Riverside Drive. As carriages pulled up to Schwab's housewarming reception in the spring of 1906, even the most jaded aristocrats fell quiet. The chateau rose before them like something transplanted from another century, another continent. Towers caught the last light of sunset. Windows glowed with the soft amber of electric chandeliers. Still a novelty in private homes. Still a signal of someone rich enough to light the night at will. Inside, the scale did the real talking. The entrance hall alone could have swallowed a modest brownstone. Marble floors mirrored the glow from crystal fixtures imported from Vienna. A grand staircase swept upward in a curve so precise It felt almost weightless, each balustrade carved with acanthus leaves and cherubs. Guests climbed toward the second floor and stepped into a gallery lined with paintings. Old masters Schwab had hunted down at auctions across Europe, their gilt frames blazing against walls covered in silk damask. But the true spectacle waited in the great hall. This was the heart of the mansion, a room designed not for comfort, but for awe. Soaring ceilings disappeared into shadow. At one end stood the pipe organ, more than 2,000 pipes hidden behind carved wooden screens capable of filling the space with sound closer to a cathedral than a private home. Schwab had hired organists to perform during dinner parties, the music swelling between courses, turning meals into something like services in a church of money. On that first evening, the organ played Handel. Guests sipped champagne and drifted through rooms that seemed to multiply without end. A library paneled in rare woods, a billiard room with tables imported from England, a winter garden where palm trees and orchids flourished beneath a glass ceiling. Servants in formal livery appeared and vanished through hidden doors, balancing silver trays, refilling glasses, adjusting details before anyone had to ask. Charles Schwab moved through his house like a conductor directing an orchestra. He greeted every guest by name, recalled details from past conversations, and made introductions that flattered both sides. His wife, Emma, stayed closer to the edges, quieter, watching. She smiled when expected. She said the right things at the right moments. But those who knew her saw something guarded in her face, not pure pride, not open discomfort, something closer to waiting, as if she expected a cost that had not yet been presented. Andrew Carnegie arrived late, as befitted his status. The old Scotsman was 70 years old now, retired from business, already deep into his campaign to give away his fortune before death. He walked slowly through the entrance hall, paused at the foot of the grand staircase, and looked up. The silence stretched. Then Carnegie turned to his former protege and delivered the verdict that would echo through New York, drawing rooms for years. "Charlie, now, my house looks like a shack." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Schwab beamed. On the surface, the line was pure praise. Proof that the student had surpassed the master, at least when it came to square footage and spectacle. But under the joke sat something sharper. Carnegie had built his fortune through discipline and restraint. He lived well, but he also gave relentlessly. His mansions were large, yet many of his buildings were meant for others. Libraries for the public, halls for music, spaces for philanthropy. Schwab's chateau served only Schwab, the newspapers noticed. Reviews of the mansion mixed admiration with unease. One columnist called the house the most magnificent private residence in America, and in the same breath wondered whether such magnificence was decent, in an age when thousands sleep in tenements. Another praised the craftsmanship but questioned the taste. Too French, too theatrical, too obviously built to impress. Schwab brushed off the criticism. He had created exactly what he wanted. The parties rolled on through that first season and into the next. Opera singers performed in the Great Hall. Politicians angled for invitations. Industrialists toured the grounds and went back to their own homes feeling slightly, uncomfortably outdone. But Emma Schwab saw what her husband did not. The rooms were too large for two people. Their footsteps echoed in corridors designed for crowds. They had no children to fill the nursery, no heirs waiting to claim the paintings in silver. The staff outnumbered the family by a ratio that bordered on absurd. Dozens of servants maintaining a house for a couple who spent half their lives on trains and steamships. At night, when the guests had gone and the organ stopped, Emma walked through the empty halls and tried to name what they had built. A home? A monument? A trap? She never voiced these doubts to Charles. He was too thrilled, too proud, too convinced that the mansion proved everything he had set out to prove. But the question lingered in the air like dust in the winter garden, settling slowly on every surface. In the next chapter, we follow the Schwabs through 2 decades of life inside their palace and watch as the emptiness Emma sensed begins to take its toll. Chapter 6: Life Inside a Steel Palace. The emptiness Emma sensed didn't disappear. It grew. By 1910, the Schwab mansion had settled into a rhythm. Not the rhythm of a home, but of an institution. Each morning began before dawn in the basement kitchen, where a team of cooks prepared breakfast for the household. Coffee percolated in silver urns. Eggs arrived from a farm upstate, delivered by a supplier who served only the wealthiest families. Bread came from a private baker. Fruit arrived from greenhouses that stayed warm and bright through New York winters. The staff numbered between 40 and 50, depending on the season. Housekeepers dusted rooms no one entered for weeks. Footmen polished silver that sat untouched in cabinets between parties. Groundskeepers tended lawns and gardens that only the Schwabs and their servants ever really saw. A private secretary managed Charles's constant stream of letters and telegrams. A social secretary curated Emma's calendar. An engineer watched over the private electrical plant. A chauffeur waited beside the automobiles that had replaced the carriages of earlier years. This small army moved through the mansion via a hidden skeleton of corridors and staircases, service passages designed to keep servants invisible. The architecture itself enforced a hierarchy. The Schwabs lived in the grand rooms with views of the Hudson, while the people who made their lives possible existed in the walls and shadows, emerging only when summoned. Emma treated the staff well. Contemporary accounts describe her as kind, even generous. She remembered birthdays, asked after families, arranged medical care when employees fell ill. But kindness could not erase how strange the arrangement was. She was a woman from a modest Pennsylvania background, now presiding over a household larger than some hotels. The role never sat entirely right on her shoulders. She filled her days with the expected duties of a Gilded Age wife, charity committees, luncheons with other society women, visits to galleries and concert halls. She redecorated rooms that did not need redecorating, ordered flowers that wilted before anyone truly enjoyed them, planned elaborate menus for dinners Charles often missed because work held him at the office, or business trips pulled him overseas. For long stretches, the mansion, for all its grandeur, was empty of the man who had built it. Charles Schwab had not created a home to live quietly in. He had built a stage. When guests filled the great hall, when the organ shook the walls and champagne sparkled in crystal, the chateau made sense. It justified itself through spectacle. But spectacle needs an audience, and audiences always go home. In the long afternoons and early mornings, stripped of music and conversation, the mansion showed its true nature. It felt less like shelter and more like a monument, a stone proof of ambition, not a place designed for ordinary human life. Schwab himself seemed allergic to stillness. He traveled constantly, to Europe for business and pleasure, to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where his steel company operated, to Washington, where he courted political connections. When he was home, he worked. When he was not working, he entertained. The idea of simply being in his own house, reading by the fire, walking the grounds with Emma, hardly fit his character at all. Emma adapted. She carved out a smaller world inside the larger one, a suite of rooms on the upper floors where she could live at a human scale. She built routines that did not depend on her husband's presence. She found comfort in a small circle of friends who visited regularly, women who understood that wealth did not guarantee happiness and who never made her feel foolish for expressing doubts. The doubts, however, stayed. The couple had no children. Whether by choice or by circumstance, the record is silent. but the absence shaped everything. The nursery on the third floor stood fully furnished and unused, a string of rooms planned for a future dynasty. Children's bedrooms, a schoolroom, a playroom, had no function. Emma sometimes walked through these spaces, running her hand along the backs of empty chairs, imagining the voices that never came. Charles did not talk about it. He pointed his paternal energy outward instead, toward his employees. At Bethlehem Steel, he played the role of benevolent father to thousands of workers. He gave speeches about loyalty and family, handed out turkeys at Christmas, funded scholarships for workers' children. The company became the dynasty the mansion could never house. And so the years passed. The mansion hosted presidents. William Howard Taft visited, and later Warren Harding. Musicians performed in the Great Hall. Charity galas raised fortunes for hospitals and orphanages. The Schwab name appeared regularly in the society pages, always paired with words like elegance, generosity, and taste. But behind the photographs and polished descriptions, the reality remained simpler and sadder. Two people moving through 75 rooms, each in their own quiet way, wondering whether any of it had been worth the price. In the next chapter, we follow Charles Schwab beyond the mansion walls, into the casinos and scandals that would slowly unravel everything he had built. Chapter 7. Fast Lane. Charles. The casinos of Monte Carlo knew him by name. Each winter, Charles Schwab appeared on the French Riviera like a migrating bird, returning to warmer water. He crossed Europe in private railroad cars, surrounded by valets and secretaries carrying enough cash to stabilize a small government treasury. At the gaming tables, croupiers greeted him with the deference reserved for men who could lose fortunes without blinking. And Schwab, for all his brilliance in business, could not resist the spin of the wheel. His gambling was no secret. Newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic reported his visits to Monte Carlo with a blend of fascination and moral outrage. In 1902, Andrew Carnegie publicly rebuked his former protege after reports surfaced of especially spectacular losses. Schwab apologized, promised reform, and the next season returned to the same tables. The cycle repeated for decades, but the roulette wheel was only the most visible symptom of something deeper. Schwab lived fast because stillness frightened him. He worked 18-hour days and then looked for pleasures intense enough to drown out the noise in his own head. Fine wines, multi-course dinners in the best restaurants of Europe, and the company of beautiful women who were not his wife. Rumors followed him across continents, whispers of affairs, of apartments quietly rented for mistresses, of a second life unfolding far from Riverside Drive. Emma heard the whispers. It would have been impossible not to. New York society fed on gossip, and her husband's behavior gave it an endless supply. Yet she never confronted him in public, never threatened divorce, never staged the dramatic scenes that would have thrilled the tabloids. Whether that silence was dignity, denial, or simple exhaustion, the record does not say. She remained in the mansion, managing the household, attending the necessary social events, playing the role of loyal wife while her husband played very different roles elsewhere. The gap between public image and private reality widened with every passing year. In speeches and interviews, Schwab presented himself as a devoted family man and benevolent captain of industry, a leader who valued loyalty above all else. He called his workers his boys, his company his family, his mansion proof that the American dream rewarded hard work and moral living. The hypocrisy was staggering, but in the Gilded Age, that kind of selective truth-telling was practically part of the job description. His business choices began to mirror the same recklessness that ruled his personal life. At Bethlehem Steel, Schwab made bold bets that sometimes paid off spectacularly and sometimes nearly sank the company. He expanded capacity based on optimistic forecasts that did not always come true. He clashed with cautious board members who urged restraint. He poured company money into projects that served his ego more than the bottom line, including a failed plan to build the largest office building in the world. The pattern was clear. Schwab struggled to distinguish between confidence and overconfidence. The same conviction that had propelled him from stake driver to steel baron now blinded him to dangers more cautious men could see plainly. He had gambled his way from poverty to vast wealth, and he could not stop gambling even when the stakes involved thousands of jobs and the survival of his empire. World War I briefly turned his addiction to risk into an advantage. Bethlehem Steel won enormous contracts to supply the Allied powers with munitions, ships, and armor plate. Profits exploded. Schwab's personal fortune, which his extravagance had already burned through once, swelled again to dizzying levels. He was hailed as a patriot, a hero of the industrial front, the man whose steel helped defeat the Kaiser. For a moment, the mansion on Riverside Drive found a new script. Victory parties celebrated the armistice. Generals, diplomats, and industrialists climbed the grand staircase to toast the end of war. Schwab stood in the great hall, receiving their praise, and it seemed briefly that his habit of always doubling down had been vindicated forever. But luck is not a business plan. And the 1920s, for all their glitter, were quietly setting the stage for a reckoning that would reach everyone. Schwab spent that decade exactly as he had spent the ones before it, traveling, entertaining, gambling, working. The music inside the mansion changed. Jazz orchestras now replaced the old string quartets. Prohibition turned alcohol into contraband, but to a man with Schwab's connections, the law was more nuisance than barrier. Champagne arrived through private channels. Whiskey flowed in crystal decanters as if the Volstead Act did not exist. The stock market climbed. Schwab's paper wealth climbed with it. He was 60 years old, then 65, still energetic, still convinced that the party, in every sense, would never end. Emma watched from her private rooms on the upper floors. She was older now, quieter, her health beginning to fail. The mansion that had once felt merely too large now resembled a mausoleum. Magnificent, cold, waiting for its story to turn. She spent more time alone, reading, writing letters to old friends, remembering the small Pennsylvania towns where she and Charles had started their lives together before steel and stone and chandeliers. She could not have known what was coming. None of them could. In the next chapter, the music stops, and everything Charles Schwab built begins to collapse. Chapter 8, The Day the Music Stopped. October 29th, 1929. Black Tuesday. On Wall Street, panic swallowed the trading floor. Men who had been millionaires at breakfast found themselves ruined by lunch. Stocks that had climbed for years collapsed in hours. The ticker machines could not keep up. Prices fell faster than the paper tape could print them. Outside the New York Stock Exchange, crowds gathered in near silence, watching their futures vanish behind tall windows. On Riverside Drive, the Schwab mansion stood quiet. No parties that week, no organ music drifting through the great hall. Charles Schwab was 67 years old, and he understood immediately what younger men refused to accept. This was not a correction, this was an ending. The crash did not obliterate him overnight. Unlike speculators who had borrowed to buy stocks, Schwab held most of his wealth in Bethlehem Steel. Real assets, real factories, real machines. But steel is only valuable when someone needs it. In the months after Black Tuesday, the demand for steel thinned to almost nothing. Construction projects froze across America. Railroads canceled plans for new track. automobile manufacturers slashed production. The skyscrapers that had been climbing over Manhattan and Chicago, monuments to the same optimism that had built Schwab's chateau, stopped mid-rise, their steel skeletons left bare against winter skies. Bethlehem Steel's stock price, which had once peaked above $140 per share, began a long slide that would eventually scrape the bottom in single digits. On paper, Schwab watched his fortune dissolve. Paper losses turned into real losses when the bills arrived. The mansion devoured money. Property taxes alone exceeded $50,000 every year, enough to buy several comfortable houses outright. The staff needed salaries regardless of Wall Street. The heating system burned through coal by the ton. Maintenance on a building this size never ended. Roof tiles cracked, pipes corroded, carved stone weathered, and demanded repair. Even the gardens insisted on constant spending, teams of workers tending lawns and flower beds that now felt like obscene luxuries. Schwab started selling. First the paintings. Old masters auctioned quietly so their absence would not become headlines. Then the automobiles. Then pieces of silver and furniture Emma had spent decades choosing. Each sale bought him a little time. None of them solved the problem. The mansion remained vast and hungry, consuming cash faster than Schwab could turn objects into money. He tried to borrow. Banks that had once competed for his signature now demanded collateral he no longer had. His reputation, which had survived gambling stories and whispered affairs, could not survive the simple arithmetic of insolvency. Charles Schwab. The boy from Williamsburg who had become president of United States Steel and later the Titan of Bethlehem was running out of cash. The staff noticed first. Salaries arrived late, then later, then stopped entirely for some positions. Senior servants who had spent decades in the house quietly looked for work elsewhere. The army of roughly 40 shrank to 30, then 20, then fewer still. Rooms that had gleamed under daily polishing gathered dust. The winter garden, starved of proper heat, lost its tropical plants one frost at a time. Emma's health declined with the household. She was around 70 now, worn down by years of managing a home that had never fully felt like hers. Doctors visited more often, nurses were hired, then dismissed when money ran short. She spent most of her time in the small, private suite she had carved out years earlier, the cluster of rooms where life still felt human-sized. Charles tried to keep up appearances. He still dressed impeccably. He still attended the social functions that would have him. He still gave speeches about American resilience and the certainty of recovery. But those who knew him saw the strain under the performance. His famous charm felt forced. His optimism rang thin. The man who had once commanded every room he entered now seemed to be asking those rooms for permission to stay. The lowest moment came in 1933. Desperate to cut his tax burden, Schwab offered the mansion to New York City as an official residence for the mayor. It was a humiliating reversal. The palace built to prove he had arrived, now dangled as a gift simply to escape its cost. He framed the proposal as civic generosity, a donation to the people of New York. Everyone understood the reality. Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia came to see for himself. He walked through the marble halls, inspected the pipe organ, stood in the winter garden where dead plants still filled their beds. Then he gave his verdict. What? Me in that? The rejection was total. LaGuardia knew that accepting such a gift would be political suicide. With millions of New Yorkers unemployed, hungry, and losing their homes, no elected official could move into a 75-room chateau without inviting rage. The mansion had become unsellable, ungiftable, unloved. In the next chapter, we watch as the palace that was supposed to prove Charles Schwab had won turns into a boarding house, and its creator slips into obscurity. Chapter 9. What, me and that? The mayor's words moved through New York society like a verdict. Fiorello LaGuardia was not a cruel man. He was a practical one. Short, rumpled, famously incorruptible, he had built his political career by speaking for ordinary New Yorkers, immigrants, workers, families crammed into tenements while palaces sat half empty on the Upper West Side. When he toured the Schwab Mansion in 1933 and delivered his verdict, he was not mocking Charles Schwab as a person. He was saying out loud a truth Schwab himself could not face. The Gilded Age was over. Its monuments were no longer triumphs. They were liabilities. LaGuardia understood exactly what would happen if he accepted the gift. Photographers would capture him on that grand staircase. Newspapers would print pictures of the mayor living in 75 rooms, while bread lines wrapped around city blocks. Opponents would turn the chateau into a symbol for everything broken in American inequality. The house Schwab had built to prove his success would destroy the career of anyone foolish enough to live in it. So LaGuardia said no, and with that refusal, the mansion's fate was effectively sealed. Schwab retreated into silence. The man who had once charmed presidents and commanded industries began avoiding reporters, declining invitations, disappearing from the society columns that had tracked his movements for decades. He was 71 years old, exhausted, watching everything he had built fall apart around him. Emma died in April of 1939. She passed quietly in the mansion she had never truly loved, cared for by the few servants who remained. The newspapers ran short obituaries: wife of the industrialist, gracious hostess, patron of charitable causes. They did not mention the decades of loneliness, the empty corridors she had walked, the husband who had so often been present in body but absent in spirit. She was 77 years old. She left no children, no memoir, no record of what she really thought of the palace on Riverside Drive. Charles did not stay in the mansion after her death. He could not. The hallways where she had walked, the sitting room where she had received guests, the bedroom where she had spent her final months, all of it became unbearable. He moved into a small apartment in a residential hotel on Park Avenue. Modest rooms, simple furniture, the opposite of everything he had spent his life constructing. The chateau stood mostly empty, not entirely abandoned. A skeleton crew of caretakers still made their rounds, keeping the property from outright collapse. But the great hall no longer shook with organ music. The winter garden held only bare soil. Dust gathered on marble floors that no one polished. The swimming pool in the basement sat drained, its tiles cracking. Room by room, the mansion began a slow slide into decay. Schwab's health followed the same downward curve. He had always seemed robust, powered by some internal engine that ignored the toll of late nights, heavy meals, and constant travel. But the depression had broken something in him that no doctor could reach. He grew thin. The famous charm flickered. Friends who visited his Park Avenue rooms reported conversations that looped back on themselves. Memories that did not quite line up. A man losing control over the story of his own life. He died on September the 18th, 1939, barely 5 months after Emma. The timing felt almost merciful, as though he had been waiting for permission to follow her. The obituaries were long but careful. They celebrated his rise from poverty, his role in building American steel, his contributions during the war years of 1917 to 1918. They mentioned the mansion on Riverside Drive in passing, with words like famous and palatial. They did not dwell on gambling, affairs, or the collapse of his finances. Death had given Charles Schwab a respectability that life had never quite allowed, but death could not save his estate. When lawyers opened his books, they confirmed what those close to him had suspected for years. Charles M. Schwab, the man who had once controlled sums counted in hundreds of millions, died with debts greater than his assets. Exact figures varied by source, but some reports claimed he owed more than $300,000 beyond what he owned. The King of Steel, who had built the largest private home in New York City, left this world technically bankrupt. The mansion itself was no longer really his to give or withhold. He had transferred ownership years earlier through legal maneuvers meant to shield assets from creditors. But paperwork could not change the underlying problem. In Depression-era America, almost no one wanted a 75-room chateau. The building sat, taxes piled up, decay sped up, and in the shadow of that fading palace, a new plan began to form, one that would turn Schwab's monument into something he never imagined and would have despised. In the next chapter, we watch the chateau become a boarding house and witness the final humiliation of a Gilded Age dream. Chapter 10. A Palace Turned Boarding House. The transformation began quietly, without announcements or ceremonies. Sometime in the early 1940s, new owners, a group of investors who had acquired the property for a fraction of its original cost, made a decision that would have horrified Charles Schwab. They would subdivide the mansion, slice its grand rooms into smaller units, turn the palace of a steel king into housing for ordinary New Yorkers who needed an affordable place to sleep more than they needed marble staircases. The work was fast and unsentimental. Walls went up where no architect had ever planned them. The Great Hall, that soaring space designed for organ concerts and presidential receptions, was carved into multiple apartments. Workers installed kitchenettes in former dressing rooms. They ran plumbing through rooms that had once held art collections. They chopped the winter garden into cramped units that kept none of its old, glass-ceilinged splendor. With every new doorway cut and every pipe laid, another piece of Schwab's vision disappeared. The new residents arrived with suitcases and children, with furniture that would have looked ridiculous in the original mansion, but fit perfectly inside the chopped-up apartments it had become. Teachers, clerks, young couples starting their first homes, war widows stretching small pensions. They climbed the same grand staircase Vanderbilts had once ascended, but now they climbed it to reach third-floor walk-ups with shared bathrooms. The irony could not have been sharper. Schwab had built his chateau to outrun poverty, to prove that a boy from Pennsylvania coal country could live like European nobility. Now his monument housed people not so different from his own parents, working families for whom a roof, 4 walls, and a private doorbell counted as triumph. The mansion had completed a circle its creator never imagined, returning to the class it was built to rise above. Life inside the converted palace felt odd, but it worked. Residents told stories of footsteps in empty corridors, doors that opened on their own, sudden cold patches in rooms that should have been warm. Whether these were ghosts or just the groans of an aging building full of hidden shafts and forgotten vents, no one knew. But the stories spread from neighbor to neighbor, giving the place a new kind of legend to replace the old one. The grounds changed just as dramatically. Lawns that had once been shaved to perfection by teams of gardeners now sprouted victory gardens. Rows of tomatoes and beans planted by residents doing their part for the war effort. Laundry lines stretched where carriages had once rolled. Children played tag on terraces, originally designed for champagne receptions. The transformation was complete. A monument to one man's excess had become a monument to shared necessity. Not everyone welcomed that change. Preservationists, still a small but insistent group in 1940s New York, protested the alterations. They argued that the Schwab Mansion was an irreplaceable piece of Beaux-Arts architecture, a building that deserved protection no matter what its owner had done or how his story ended. They wrote letters to editors, petitioned city officials, begged for someone in power to intervene. Almost no one answered. New York in the 1940s had little patience for nostalgia. The city was growing, shifting, hauling itself out of the Depression, and bracing for the post-war boom everyone felt coming. Old buildings were seen as obstacles, not heirlooms. The Schwab mansion, tied in the public mind to Gilded Age excess and financial collapse, felt especially out of step. It stood for exactly what the new America wanted to bury. The war years passed. Residents moved in and moved out. The building decayed despite, and in some ways because of, its new use. Keeping a chateau alive as a patchwork of apartments turned out to be more expensive than maintaining it as a single residence. Roof leaks multiplied. Stone facades cracked and spalled. The heating system, designed for an era of cheap coal and plentiful staff, struggled to warm dozens of separate units without wasting money and fuel. By 1947, the investors who had carved up the mansion reached their own conclusion. The building was no longer worth saving. The land beneath it, an entire city block between 73rd and 74th Streets, was worth far more than any aging structure that might stand on top of it. The hard arithmetic of Manhattan real estate, which had always shaped the city's fate, now demanded a sacrifice. The decision happened in boardrooms, not public meetings, no public vote, no hearings. One day residents received notices slipped under their doors. They would have to find new homes. The building would be demolished. Something new and bigger would rise in its place. The reaction was muted. A handful of tenants complained to reporters. Preservationists issued one last round of outraged letters. But most New Yorkers simply shrugged. They had never loved the Schwab mansion. Many had never forgiven its builder for what it symbolized. If the wrecking ball wanted to wipe away this particular reminder of inequality, who were they to stand in front of it? The evacuation took months. Families boxed up their lives and scattered across the city. The Victory Gardens were left to wither. The laundry lines came down. Room by room, floor by floor. The mansion emptied until only echo and dust remained. In the next chapter, we step into those abandoned halls one final time and watch the last days of the largest private home New York ever knew. Chapter 11. A gift nobody can use. The silence inside was absolute. By late 1947, the last residents had departed, leaving behind only what they could not carry. Broken furniture, stained mattresses, children's drawings still tacked to walls that had once displayed old masters. The Schwab mansion stood empty for the first time since its completion 4 decades earlier. No servants polished the marble. No organ filled the great hall with sound. No footsteps echoed on the grand staircase. The building had become what it had always secretly been, a shell waiting to be discarded. City inspectors arrived to assess the property. Their reports drew a portrait of elegant decay. Water damage had buckled hardwood floors in the east wing. Plaster fell in chunks from ceilings that still held faint traces of hand-painted murals. The Winter Garden, stripped of its glass panels during the conversion to apartments, now stood open to the weather. Rain pooled on stone where tropical plants had once flourished, turning the space into a shallow, dirty basin. Everywhere the inspectors looked, they found proof of a building that had outlived its purpose. The swimming pool in the basement had become a tomb. Drained years earlier, its Italian tiles were cracked and buried under debris. Rats nested in the changing rooms. Gymnasium equipment that had once been state-of-the-art rusted quietly in corners. Even the bowling alley, that toy of Gilded Age leisure, had warped beyond use. Its lanes buckled, its pins scattered like forgotten props from someone else's party. Upstairs, the damage was less dramatic, but just as final. The subdivisions that had carved the mansion into apartments had destroyed its architectural logic. Load-bearing walls were compromised. Electrical wiring, thrown in quickly to serve dozens of separate units, posed fire hazards throughout the structure. The heating system, jury-rigged to warm a warren of small spaces instead of a single great house, had corroded past the point of sensible repair. Restoring the mansion to anything close to its original condition would cost more than building an entirely new structure from scratch. That was the calculation that sealed the mansion's fate. The investors who owned the property had no interest in preservation. They saw land, not legacy, an entire city block in Manhattan, more valuable than almost any single building that might sit on it. The post-war housing boom was accelerating. Returning soldiers needed apartments, young families needed affordable homes. The city needed density, not monuments to dead millionaires. Architects submitted proposals for the site. The winning design was aggressively practical. A 15-story apartment building with more than 600 units, red brick, minimal ornamentation, maximum efficiency. The new building would house more people under one roof than the entire Riverside Drive neighborhood had held in Schwab's day. It would be called, with an irony almost no one bothered to point out, Schwab House. The name was not a tribute, it was shorthand. The block had been known as the Schwab property for so long that any other name would have confused postal workers and taxi drivers. So Charles Schwab's name would outlive his mansion, attached to exactly the kind of practical, middle-class housing he had spent his life trying to leave behind. Preservation groups made one last push. They wrote to museums, universities, historical societies. Anyone who might see value in saving even fragments of the structure. Could the grand staircase be moved? Could the pipe organ find a second life in a concert hall? Could the carved stonework be salvaged for students and architects to study? The answers came back the same every time. The cost of disassembling and relocating those elements would exceed any realistic benefit. The mansion would not be partially saved. It would be erased. A few artifacts slipped through the net. Doorknobs and hinges appeared in antique shops. Pieces of carved limestone found their way into private gardens and collections. Someone claimed to have rescued tiles from the Winter Garden, though no one ever proved it. The great pipe organ, the instrument that had once filled 75 rooms with Handel and Bach, was sold to a church in Pennsylvania, returning in a small way to the state where Schwab's story had begun. But these fragments were crumbs, not a record. The mansion's real legacy, its sheer scale, its ambition, its defiant claim that one man could plant a palace in the middle of democratic America, could not survive in pieces. It existed as architecture, and architecture needs space and context to make sense. Remove the building from its block, and you strip away the meaning. The city issued demolition permits in early 1948. Workers raised barriers around the property. Neighbors received notices warning of noise and dust. The machinery of destruction rolled onto Riverside Drive and waited for the signal. Charles Schwab had been dead for 9 years. Emma for 9 years as well. No family members remained to see what came next. No heirs to protest. No children to mourn. The couple who had built the largest private home in New York City left behind no dynasty, no household, no one to argue that any of it should stay. The wrecking ball arrived on a cold January morning. In the next chapter, we stand inside the mansion during its final hours and watch through the eyes of the people who brought it down. Chapter 12. Inside the Final Days. The young worker's name is lost to history, but his story survives in fragments. Passed between construction crews, preserved in a single newspaper interview, retold in the kind of oral tradition that clings to vanishing landmarks. He was 23 years old in January 1948, a demolition laborer, one of dozens hired to dismantle what remained of the Schwab mansion. The pay was decent. The work was brutal. On his first day, before the wrecking ball took its first swing, a foreman sent him inside to survey the structure and mark potential hazards. He entered through the servants' entrance on 73rd Street, a modest door the Schwabs themselves had almost certainly never used. The contrast between that plain doorway and what lay beyond stopped him cold. He found himself in a corridor paneled in oak, the wood still catching a faint shine beneath decades of dust. Light filtered through grimy windows and picked out carved moldings no one had bothered to clean in years. The air smelled of plaster, cold stone, and something older he could not quite name. He walked deeper into the building. The kitchen sprawled across half the basement level, commercial grade even by 1940s standards. Iron stoves large enough to roast whole animals lined one wall. Copper pots, tarnished but intact, hung from racks that seemed to float toward a ceiling he could barely see. He tried to picture the staff that had worked here, the meals that had come out of these ovens, the army of servants needed to feed a household that once entertained presidents and princes. The scale overwhelmed him. It felt less like a kitchen and more like a factory for luxury. Upstairs, the grand staircase rose before him like something from a fever dream. Marble steps, each wider than the hallway of his own apartment, wrought iron railings twisted into leaves and vines. He climbed slowly, his work boots leaving tracks in the dust that had settled since the last tenants left. At the landing, a stained glass window, cracked, but still mostly whole, scattered colored light across walls, stripped of their paintings. Faint rectangles on the fabric marked where canvases had once hung, ghosts of frames long gone. The great hall took his breath away. Even subdivided, even scarred, even empty of furniture and music and life, the room still carried a presence that went beyond dimensions. The ceiling vanished into shadow. The walls, rough where partitions had been removed, still showed scraps of silk damask clinging to the plaster. At the far end, the pipe organ remained, too large and complicated for the church that had bought it to remove in a hurry. Its pipes rose like frozen columns of sound, waiting for hands that would never touch its keys again. The worker stood in the middle of the hall and tried to understand what he was seeing. He had grown up in Brooklyn, in rooms where families of 5 squeezed into spaces smaller than this single chamber. He had never known anyone who lived like this. He had never imagined that anyone could. He continued his survey. Room after room offered the same collision of grandeur and ruin. A bathroom with gold-plated fixtures, the metal tarnished to a sickly green. A library with built-in shelves reaching 20 feet high, empty of books but still majestic in proportion. A bedroom with a fireplace large enough for a grown man to stand inside, its mantel carved with scenes from Greek mythology, now dulled by dust. In one of the servants' quarters, a small room on the 4th floor tucked up under the eaves, he found something that stopped him. Scratched into the plaster beside the window, almost invisible unless you were looking for it, were initials and a date, J.M., marked there in 1904. A worker from the original construction crew had left his mark. Someone like him, a young laborer earning wages by building a rich man's dream, had stood in that exact spot 44 years earlier and decided to claim a tiny piece of immortality. The worker took out his pocket knife. He hesitated. Then he carved his own initials beside the old ones. 2 anonymous men, separated by almost half a century, joined by a gesture no one else would ever notice. On his way out, he removed a doorknob, brass, heavy, shaped like a lion's head. He told himself it was just a souvenir, something to show his children one day. But he knew it was more than that. It was proof. Proof that this place had been real, that he had walked these halls, that beauty on this scale had once stood in stone and wood, even if it could not last. The demolition began the next morning. The wrecking ball swung in slow, terrible arcs. Each impact sent stone dust billowing across Riverside Drive. Each crash tore away another piece of facade, another tower, another room that had cost more to build than most families would earn in a lifetime. The workers kept their professional distance, muscles moving on instinct. But some of them paused between swings, watching the chateau crumble, aware, whether they admitted it or not, that they were erasing something that would never be built again. By spring, only rubble remained. In the next chapter, we watch a new building rise from those ruins and see what replaced the largest private home New York had ever known. Chapter 13. From Chateau to Schwab House. The rubble disappeared faster than anyone expected. By late spring of 1948, trucks had hauled away the last fragments of pink granite and carved limestone. The lot between 73rd and 74th Streets lay bare for the first time in half a century. A raw gap in the streetscape where a palace had stood. Neighbors who had grown used to the chateau's outline now stared at open sky, unsettled by the sudden absence of towers and turrets. Construction began almost immediately. The new building rose with the stripped-down efficiency of post-war America. No hand-carved stonework, no blocks hauled from European quarries, no years-long schedule chasing some ideal of perfection. Instead, standardized red brick, prefabricated components, union crews working in shifts to meet hard deadlines. The developers wanted apartments ready for occupancy by 1950. They got them. Schwab House, the name stuck, irony and all, climbed 15 stories above Riverside Drive. Its facade offered almost nothing in the way of ornament. Functional window frames, a modest entrance canopy, clean lines, and right angles. The design philosophy was bluntly utilitarian. Maximum units, minimum waste, rents within reach of middle-class families who needed space more than spectacle. 620 apartments eventually filled the structure, each compact and practical, laid out for living rather than impressing. The contrast with its predecessor could hardly have been sharper, where Schwab's mansion had sprawled horizontally across an entire block. The new building stacked life vertically, concentrating density into a single volume. Where the chateau had needed around 50 servants just to keep up appearances, Schwab House managed with a handful of doormen, porters, and maintenance workers. Where the original structure had once sheltered 2 people in 75 rooms, its replacement housed thousands in apartments that averaged 4 rooms each. The first residents arrived in 1950, teachers from nearby public schools, office workers commuting to Midtown, young couples saving for eventual houses in the suburbs, retirees living on fixed incomes. They signed leases without knowing, or particularly caring, what stood here before. Schwab House was simply an address, a spot on a map, a place to receive mail and tell taxi drivers. Some of the older neighbors tried to explain. They showed yellowing photographs of the mansion, described parties they had watched from across the street, remembered the day the wrecking ball hit the first tower. Their stories sounded like fairy tales. A 75-room chateau, a private indoor swimming pool, a pipe organ filling a house with music, on this corner? The young families smiled, nodded, and went back to unpacking boxes. Memory thinned with surprising speed. Within a decade, the Schwab mansion had become a rumor. Within 2 decades, even the rumor blurred. Old-timers contradicted one another, mixed up the Schwab property with other vanished estates, tangled dates, until the real story vanished behind competing versions. The few photographs that still circulated showed a structure that looked more like a Loire Valley castle than anything people believed could have existed in Manhattan. Surely there had been some exaggeration. Surely nothing that grand had ever stood on Riverside Drive. But the land remembered, even when the people did not. The footprint of Schwab House matched, almost exactly, the footprint of Schwab's mansion. The same boundaries, the same proportions. An entire city block given over to a single building. A quiet anomaly in Manhattan's grid of narrow lots and shared walls. Visitors who knew nothing of the past sometimes paused on the sidewalk, sensing something odd about the scale without knowing why. The space felt too generous, too open, as if the block still held the outline of something larger. A ghost of grandeur lingered in the geometry. Riverside Drive itself kept evolving. The great houses that had once stood shoulder to shoulder with Schwab's chateau disappeared one by one, replaced by apartment buildings much like Schwab House. The dream of rivaling Fifth Avenue, of building a parallel aristocracy on the Hudson, faded and then vanished. The Upper West Side shifted into what it remains today: comfortable, intellectual, slightly bohemian, a neighborhood for professors, writers, musicians, not a neighborhood for steel kings. Inside Schwab House, new stories took root. Residents built their own traditions, their own private history, their own sense of belonging. Children grew up in apartments their grandparents had first rented. Holiday decorations appeared in the same windows year after year. Friendships formed in elevators and laundry rooms. A community emerged that had nothing to do with Charles Schwab, nothing to do with the Gilded Age, nothing to do with the mansion their building had replaced. This was, in some ways, the purest form of erasure. Not just destruction, but replacement. Not simple forgetting, but overwriting. The chateau had been removed so completely that its successor could become ordinary. Just another apartment house on a street lined with apartment houses, unremarkable precisely because almost no one remembered what had stood there first. In the next chapter, we return to the present day and try to rebuild, from memory and research, the palace that New York chose to erase. Chapter 14. Rebuilding a Lost House from Memory. The research begins in archives. You sit in the reading room of the New York Historical Society, surrounded by cardboard boxes that no one has opened in decades. Folders labeled Schwab, Charles M. yield fragments, newspaper clippings gone yellow at the edges, brief mentions in society columns, a handful of photographs that escaped the general indifference of history. Each piece adds a stroke to the picture, but the picture stays incomplete. The mansion existed for less than 50 years. It vanished before the era of obsessive documentation. Most of what we know comes from the memories of people who are themselves now gone. The photographs are the most precious artifacts. You spread them across the table, arranging them like pieces of a puzzle. Here, the facade from Riverside Drive, towers rising against a pale winter sky. Here, the grand staircase, a woman in Edwardian dress frozen mid-step as she climbs towards some forgotten reception. Here, the winter garden, palm trees impossibly lush behind walls of glass. Here, a partial view of the great hall, the pipe organ just visible in the background, chairs lined up for a concert that ended a century ago. The images are beautiful and infuriating. Photographers of that era loved formal compositions, staged scenes that showed grandeur but hid the small details. You can see that the mansion was magnificent. You cannot see how it felt to walk those halls, to hear footsteps echo on marble, to smell the warm, damp air of the winter garden, to feel the vibration in your chest when the organ filled the rooms with Bach. So you turn to written sources. Contemporary newspaper accounts describe the mansion in tones that swing between awe and skepticism. One reporter called it a poem in stone. Another dismissed it as the most expensive proof of insecurity ever constructed in Manhattan. Architectural journals dissected its French influences, arguing over whether Maurice Hébert had truly synthesized his Loire Valley inspirations or merely reproduced them. Society columnists obsessed over other things: guest lists, menu courses, the flowers arranged for receptions. They cataloged who sat next to whom, who wore which dress, who came late and who did not come at all. Almost no one thought to describe the ordinary daily life: the quiet mornings, the empty afternoons, the mood of the house when no one was performing. You begin searching for people instead of paper. Descendants of servants, maybe. Children of guests who might have inherited family stories. The trail goes cold almost immediately. The staff scattered when the mansion became apartments. The guests are long dead, their memories buried with them. A few genealogical leads end at nursing homes and cemetery records. The human chain between present and past has broken. And then, a small discovery. An antique dealer in Connecticut answers one of your letters. He says he owns a doorknob from the Schwab mansion. Brass, shaped like a lion's head. Bought decades ago at an estate sale, accompanied by a handwritten note that claims it came from the Schwab property. He sends photographs. The doorknob is heavy and elaborate, clearly made for a building that expected to impress everyone who touched its doors. Whether it truly came from the mansion is impossible to prove, but the story fits. The dealer agrees to let you examine it in person. You hold the doorknob in your hands. The brass has darkened with age but keeps its sharp lines. The mane, the tight mouth, the sense of weight and permanence. It feels like something built to last centuries, not decades. You think about the young demolition worker who might have pocketed this very piece, who carved his initials beside those of a construction worker from 1904, who understood that some fragments deserve to be saved even when nobody is watching. The tools now exist to rebuild what was lost, if only as an echo. You begin working with digital artists to construct a three-dimensional model of the mansion, using the photographs and surviving architectural plans as your map. The process is painstaking. Every window placement must be checked, every roofline angle measured, every tower height estimated from shadows in old glass plate images. Slowly, on a screen, the chateau reassembles itself. Walls rise from a digital grid. Towers climb. The winter garden stretches out beneath a restored glass ceiling. The grand staircase curves back into existence. Room by room, the structure that New York erased begins to return. Not in stone, but in pixels. Then you take the model outside. You stand on the corner of 73rd and Riverside with a tablet in your hands. An augmented reality app overlays the three-dimensional reconstruction onto the modern streetscape. And there, ghostly, translucent, impossible, the Schwab mansion rises again. Its towers pierce the sky above the real Schwab house. Its terraces spread across sidewalks where pedestrians now hurry through invisible flower beds. The winter garden floats where parked cars line the curb. For a moment, past and present occupy the same coordinates, separated only by time and the choice, in 1948, to demolish instead of preserve. The effect is unsettling and strangely moving. For a brief instant, you understand what Charles Schwab must have felt when he first stood on this corner and saw his dream in his mind before a single stone was laid. The ambition, the hunger, the urgent need to prove that a poor boy from Pennsylvania could build something that would outlast him. It did not outlast him. Nothing does. But for this one moment, held in digital light and stitched together from memory, paper, and code, the mansion exists again. Not as a home, not as a palace, but as a question we can finally look in the eye. In the next chapter, we ask what the Schwab mansion really teaches us about wealth, about legacy, and about how a city decides what is worth remembering and what it is willing to let disappear. Chapter 15. What we choose to remember. The digital ghost fades from your screen. You lower the tablet and see what is actually there. Red brick, ordinary windows, a doorman checking his phone. Schwab House. 600 families living where one man once tried to build eternity. What does the Schwab mansion really teach us? The obvious lesson is about hubris. Charles Schwab built a palace to prove he had won. Won against poverty, against the Protestant establishment, against everyone who once looked down on the boy from Williamsburg. But the victory monument slowly turned into a cage. The house meant to shout his triumph ended up revealing his fear. The larger the chateau grew, the smaller its owner seemed inside it. Every new tower, every new room, looked less like confidence and more like proof that confidence was missing. There is another lesson, though, quieter and, in the end, sharper. Schwab believed stone could lock meaning in place, that if he built something grand enough, permanent enough, dazzling enough, he would matter forever. He trusted in walls and roofs and marble more than in how people would tell his story. He was wrong. The mansion lasted 42 years, less time than many of today's home loans. The stone that was supposed to outlast generations became landfill before his own generation had fully passed from the scene. What survived was not the architecture, it was the narrative wrapped around it. We are talking about this house now, because Schwab's collapse turned out to be more gripping than his climb. The parties, the gambling, the slow financial slide, the mayor's brutal "what, me and that?" The wrecking ball? These scenes remain vivid long after every physical trace of the building vanished. The mansion exists now only as story, carried from researcher to writer to viewer, rebuilt not in stone, but in imagination. Maybe this is the only kind of immortality anyone ever really gets. The Gilded Age produced hundreds of great houses. Most are gone. A few survive as museums. The Vanderbilt Palaces in Newport, the Frick on Fifth Avenue, saved because someone at some point decided they were worth the trouble and expense of preservation. No one made that choice for the Schwab mansion. It was erased so thoroughly that even its ghost barely finds a place to stand. And yet here we are, on Riverside Drive in our minds, holding old photographs, overlaying digital models, picturing towers that no longer exist. The house lives because we choose to keep talking about it. Memory is not passive. It is work. It is a decision to carry some stories forward and let others fade into the background noise of history. Charles Schwab wanted to be remembered as the man who built something permanent. Instead, he is remembered as the man who built something that disappeared, and in disappearing, left behind a question that hangs over every fortune, every monument, every attempt to buy a legacy in stone. What remains when the stone is gone?